This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza, and right now we're in no man's land. Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied, Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said. On this week's edition of How Did We Get Here, a bit of a departure, although it is still about background and context. As the film 1917 wins 3 Academy Awards, I ask, is it just a flight of magnificent imagination, or is it authentic? I've been talking to one of the foremost experts on World War I, Alan Wakefield. We met in the magnificent setting of the Imperial War Museum. Alan Wakefield, thanks very much for talking to us for the podcast How Did We Get Here? Talking to you here in the Imperial War Museum. You are the head of World War I and the early 20th century conflict. Has there been a big upsurge in interest in that, partly because of this film?
Yeah, really partly this film, Peter Jackson's film last year using colourised IWM footage and interviews, that's the one. And also the centenary as well, which we've at the IWM was sort of heading up for UK, along with the government. So yeah, there's been a definite upsurge in interest.
Okay, so looking at the film 1917, let's talk about how authentic or not it is. It starts in April 1917. Just sketch out for us what was going on the Western Front at that time.
Okay, well interestingly, it's 6th of April 1917, which is actually the day when the USA enters the war against Germany, so quite a significant date.
Although the Americans don't get a look at it in the film, I seem to remember.
That's right, which in a way is historically accurate because they obviously hadn't arrived by that time. They were still training their army to send across the Atlantic. On the Western Front in April, the Germans in 1916, having fought the Battle of the Somme and the Battle of Verdun, had lost 1.5 million men, very short of manpower, and they needed to basically shorten their line on the Western Front. So they withdrew to the Hindenburg Line, which actually released troops to actually be mobile reserves. So that was one reason that they'd been really pummeled in 1916. So 1917 was almost an admission by the Germans that they were on the back foot.
Okay, that's interesting. So they did actually pull back because that is the sort of basis of the film. So that is historically accurate, that there was this withdrawal of the Germans on a great section of the front line, and the Allies basically sort of worked out that was what was happening.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and it was very skillfully done. I mean, most of it was done under cover of darkness, leaving small bodies of men in the front line to make it look like the Germans were still occupying the line while the majority of the troops pulled out. And they made it very difficult for the Allied advance, basically smashing everything up, putting booby-traps in, etc., to slow the Allied advance to actually follow up to the Hindenburg Line.
You talk about booby-traps, I mean, there is a scene in the film where they're on the ground in a bunker and there's a booby-trap there, so that, again, is reasonably accurate.
Yeah, I mean, we've got diary and letter first-hand accounts of people coming across these booby-traps or reporting that, you know, people would pick up a German helmet as a souvenir, and it would actually be attached to a bomb, which would then go off. One man actually said that he slept in a bunk and he woke up in the morning feeling something sticking into his back, and he took the bedclothes off, and it was actually a German shell underneath, which they thought was a bomb, which didn't go off.
And that had been left as some sort of booby trap. Okay. I mean, again, at the start of the film, the two soldiers, they get to the front line and they've been told the Germans have gone, but they don't know. And a lot of the troops they're talking to are saying, well, you can go out into no man's land if you like, but you know, rather you than me. I mean, again, would that have been accurate? They just wouldn't have been sure when they actually climbed out to start crossing no man's land.
Yeah, I mean, the withdrawal was a unique event. The Germans were very much into holding the ground that they'd taken. So this idea that them withdrawing on quite a wide front to quite a depth was a real surprise for the Allies.
And obviously been able to confirm it with like planes, because there's obviously aircraft in the film.
Yeah, I mean there are. I mean, if you look at the scene where Colin Firth is playing the brigade commander, he's actually got aerial photographs, and he actually references aerial photographs that he knows the Germans have set up a new line. So the high command would have had that information relatively early on, And there was always patrolling into no man's land, so patrols would have gone forward and found that it was quiet in sectors, and then they would have had to try to find out why that was. But that may not have percolated down to the ordinary soldier in the front line particularly quickly.
Okay, and then the idea that the high command, the generals or the brigade commanders, whatever, would they have had to rely on men physically carrying a message through such dangerous terrain? Couldn't they have radio telephones or some sort of communication equipment?
Well, there's a sort of a hierarchy in communications. So the brigade commander, his HQ would have been pretty well behind the lines. He would have had wireless communication using Morse code, but the wireless was too bulky to take anywhere near the front line. So he's actually in the battalion headquarters, where he's seen in the bunker underground. There they would have had field telephones. The problem with field telephones is the cables are stretched across the ground, they get blown up.
At that stage, obviously, you've literally physically got a line which is connecting you.
Yeah. It meant that those would get blown up by artillery fire or horses or mules standing on them. Then you would have to send somebody out to fix the line. If you didn't have time to do that, you had to find other ways of getting messages forward. Obviously, you could drop messages from aircraft as well, using message containers. But if the weather conditions were poor, the aircraft couldn't fly, and then at the end of the day, you are reliant on what were called runners, and that was literally a guy carrying a message, and that was reliant even in attacks into the front line. The last form of communication was basically a guy carrying a message written by an officer.
So that scene at the end, spoiler alert, where the message is handed over to a commander who is in the process of carrying out an attack. I mean, that could happen. Could have happened.
Yeah, definitely.
Did happen.
Yeah, and the big problem was, especially if it was actually an offensive operation, is the information getting back to a commander would be very patchy. Some places the field telephones would work, so they would be getting pretty quick information exchange. Other places, all the communications are out. A runner may get through, runner may get killed. So the problem is the commanders are working with very sort of patchy information.
Okay. What about the look of the troops, the British troops that we see in the film? What they're wearing, the equipment they have. How authentic would you say that was? That
was very good, I thought. That they were carrying pretty much proper equipment. They had two military advisors working on the programme, on the film. So they were carrying the correct kit. They were carrying, I mean, the two guys who are actually delivering the message were actually carrying what we call fighting order, where they've dumped some of the heavier equipment and just carrying what they need to actually go and do this actual operation that they've got to do.
They'd have had a bigger pack with them most of the time.
There's normally a large pack which you would carry around behind the lines, carrying all of the stuff you needed, like lots of spare clothing, personal items, etc. When you went into the trenches, you'd leave that with your unit transport, and then you had a small pack.
And so the unit transport would be a couple of miles up behind the line?
Yeah, okay. Which is all like horse transport with wagons, etc.
Okay. And again, the two main characters talk about going home for leave. I mean, that happened. You weren't stuck in the trenches for months at a time, or were you?
No, I mean, this is the thing. People think that a soldier in the First World War was in the trenches for the entire period of their time, but there were regular rotations. So a unit would spend 8 days in a frontline trench, then it would go into reserve, which is a trench line 2 or 3 trenches back, and spend a small period of time there. Then they would go back behind the lines, and they could be behind the lines again for a week, a couple of weeks, and then they would rotate through again. So the idea was always to change the troops going through. The only time that may not happen as frequently is if there was a large attack or something going on where there was a shortage of men. Then you would have to stay in the front line longer.
What about actually going back to the UK?
Yeah, there was regular leave back to the UK, officers and other ranks.
How often?
It sort of depended. You would probably get back every 6 months or so.
And stay for how long?
You'd probably get a couple of weeks. And you'd go back. It was a very well worked out system. You'd come out of the trenches, probably get on a lorry, go back to a base depot, then get train back to the Channel ports and a boat across the UK, and you'd have a free rail pass to actually get you home.
I mean, is there any evidence that the people running the army kind of worked out that this was basically the way you had to do it so that men could stand this life?
I don't think there was a study of psychology in the modern sense of the word, but the officers in charge, they weren't stupid. The old idea about lions led by donkeys has been busted apart by academics, and if the study of the documents are out there. And the commanders knew that to keep the army properly functioning, to keep morale up, you had to take men out of the line, because you had to train them as well. So you had to get men out of the line to train, to rest. You had to send men home. It was good for morale again. The problem was there were British troops serving much further away, people in the Middle East, etc. Very few of them would come home to the UK on leave, but they did try to get them leave in places like India. So you would actually get them out of the theatre of war, get them somewhere totally away from it, so they could rest.
What the Americans called R&R.
Yeah.
Again, there's a scene where one of the main characters jumps into a truck, and there's a couple of, looks like Indian serving soldiers in the back of the truck. Would that have happened?
Well, there were Indian troops on the Western Front up until mid-1918. The Indian troops arrived in September 1914.
So very early.
Yeah, they sent about 100,000 Indian soldiers. The British Expeditionary Force had been pretty heavily smashed by the first couple of months in the war. So they were fighting almost a rearguard action at Ypres, where the Germans were almost going to break through. And a combination of this Indian Corps, 2 Indian infantry divisions and 2 cavalry divisions, plus territorial forces, part-time soldiers from the UK. They were rushed over to France, and some French troops actually solidified the line and stopped the German breakthrough. So the Indian troops were very important. The Indian infantry is sent away from the Western Front. It's sent to modern-day Iraq at the end of 1915, where we're fighting the Turks. So the infantry disappear, but the cavalry stay on the Western Front until mid-1918, when they go to Palestine, and they take part.
When you say cavalry,
yeah,
these people aren't riding around on horses on the Western Front.
Well, this is the thing with cavalry. They soon work out, obviously, that with trench warfare, you large cavalry formations are not going to play a major role unless there's a breakthrough. The cavalry are always there in a major offensive, like the Somme, just in case there's a breakthrough. Because if there is a breakthrough, the only quick way we can exploit a breakthrough is cavalry, because we don't have lots of motorised infantry, we don't have quick tanks. So the cavalry are always there, just behind the line, waiting for that breakthrough, which unfortunately doesn't happen until 1918. But what they do with the cavalry is they train them to fight as infantry, because they start to lose manpower. So the idea is that the cavalry do spend time on foot in the trenches as well.
Okay, so when he jumps into the truck and there's British Tommies and a couple of Indian soldiers in there as well, again, that could be perfectly reasonable, something that could have happened.
Yeah. I mean, the fact they're wearing different uniforms intimates that they're in different units.
But somehow they've ended up.
Yeah. I mean, it could happen because Indian units served alongside British units. I mean, there were individuals, Indian individuals, and also Black British soldiers who joined British units. So towards the end of the film, there are a couple of black British soldiers.
That's true.
And that's actually factually correct. We've got the diary of a chap called Arthur Roberts, who was actually from Scotland, and he joined a Scottish infantry battalion and served through 1917-1918.
And he was a black British soldier.
Yeah. It was quite rare. Because of the ethnic population was not as big in those days, but they were able to join up. So some of them fought in British units wearing the same uniform as everybody else.
So seeing Indian soldiers and black British soldiers as well in that film is again pretty authentic.
Yeah. And it's one of those untold stories as well. It's been a story that's sort of been forgotten. So putting them in actually redresses the balance, and I think when you sort of pan round and you see a face you're not expecting to see, it does make people think, and then perhaps go and explore those stories a bit more. Okay.
There's a scene where you're in a French town which is being devastated, and there's civilians, and in fact it's clear that there's been some sort of atrocity carried out on civilians a bit later. Is that authentic? Would the civilians have been so close to the front line, behind the German front line?
The civilians were pretty close to the front line. I mean, in the early part of the war, there were still Belgian and French farmers actually cultivating fields which were under shell fire. Later in the war, they did tend to evacuate people to slightly further behind the lines. But when the Germans withdraw, I mean, in 1918 especially, when the British Army has broken through and it's more open warfare, the Germans didn't have time to evacuate the local population. So what they would do is just make them get into cellars. Then the Germans would pull back, and the British would then be left with lots of French civilians to deal with. And in a way, I suppose the Germans may have felt that it was a way to slow the advance, because what you've done is left a basically displaced population in a destroyed village, and they have to be dealt with. So the British then had to get translators in to basically vet these people and then to evacuate them back down the line. So there were definitely civilians around.
This is a tricky one, and I'm sorry to bowl this one at you. In terms of the way the men are speaking, in terms of not just the language, but even their kind of mindset, to use a modern phrase, did it ring true to you? I mean, it's difficult to say. I mean, but you've studied a lot of diaries, I'm sure, and a lot of contemporary documents. Would that be the way those men would have thought and spoken?
In some ways, I think the main two characters, I think they've got that idea of the family connections and the links with home and things like this. And that was a very important part of the British soldiers' experience, again, morale-wise, where the postal service always made sure that letters and parcels got to the soldier in the front line no matter where he was, and you could always send a letter, whatever, home. So that idea of always having thoughts of your family, etc., was definitely a part of the mindset of the British soldier. I mean, it's very difficult to generalise about the language used.
I mean, by 1917, for instance, would there have been mutterings about what is this all for, or would there have been still a pretty solid, I'm talking about the British Army here, a pretty solid view that we're in it and we've got to keep going?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing with the British Army is there's no large-scale breakdown in morale as there was in the French Army in 1917, where they refused to attack, but they would defend their lines. And the German Army in 1918, and obviously the Russians crash out of the war big time, and a lot of that is based on how the war is being run. But with the British, although there's lots of moaning, and they always say with the British soldier, if he stops moaning, that's the point to start worrying about the British soldier. So there's lots of griping. The British soldier's mindset right up until the end of the war is, this is a war we have to win, we have to beat the Germans. So there was no large-scale, sort of doubting why we're fighting the war.
I think Sam Mendes actually came here, am I right in saying, and the director and came to the Imperial War Museum, or did some research. Is that right?
Yeah, and also the two lead actors as well. They came and they were all reading letters, diaries, and accounts from that period to start getting immersed in the sort of the mindset and what was actually going on historically.
Did you provide any advice for them as a matter of interest?
Not on that, but they did come to me to learn about aerial photographs. So that briefing scene at the beginning where Colin Firth's got this huge aerial photograph, what they did was the aircraft would go over, take photographs of the trenches. Those would come back, and they would make a big mosaic of overlapping photographs. That would then in itself be photographed and then annotated, and then copies of that would go out to officers as part of the briefing material for operations. So they did go to that level of detail to come measure these things, take photographs, and then mock these up. And when you think it's only on screen for sort of 30 seconds, it's quite impressive.
It shows the care they were taking.
And it was me pointing, going, "Oh, I helped with that bit."
Well, you're right to feel proud about that. So summing it up, you're obviously someone who knows this subject extremely well, cares very much about it. When you came out of seeing the film, what do you think?
I thought it was pretty good. I mean, you've got to say, it is a film at the end of the day. So there were things in there that you could say weren't historically accurate.
Okay.
But it would give
us one.
Okay. there's a scene where they attack at the end of the film, and this is 1917, and the British infantry basically get out of the trench and they're running across no man's land. There's no supporting, to start off with, there's no supporting artillery fire. Also by 1917, British infantry tactics have evolved into sections within platoons. Everybody's a specialist. In the Battle of the Somme in 1916, everybody just had a rifle, and you just basically went across as a wave of infantry. By 1917, you've got light machine guns, you've got people with rifle grenades to offer fire support for riflemen, and also people who are expert at throwing hand grenades. And everybody worked in small tactics. There was also what they called a creeping barrage, where the barrage would start in no man's land and move forward very, very slowly, and our infantry would advance immediately behind that barrage. The idea being that as soon as that barrage lifted from the German front line, our troops would be in the front line, which would give the Germans no time to come out of their dugouts and set up their machine guns as they had in the Somme. So there were things like this, but when you look at it, for the actual dramatic effect of the film, you needed the guy trying to deliver the message, and he's almost running against the tide of these people running past him. So you get the immediacy of the effect.
It's a fantastic scene that you would say, in April 1917, British troops would not have been
British troops would have been, there would have been much more standardised way of getting the men across no man's land, and artillery is the key to the battlefield in the First World War, and there's very little artillery. But just things like that. But the actual representation of the trench line, the representation of the soldiers, no man's land is done really, really well, and also the German trenches and dugouts, and the destruction behind the German lines where they've withdrawn with all the trees cut down. And the Germans went to that length of, felling trees, to block roads, but also just chopping down orchards. Almost for the hell of it.
As you see in the film, where one of the characters
and it's almost like, why have they done this?
Yeah.
And we had
that is true.
Yeah, they literally, it was a scorched earth policy. Nothing's going to be left here. If we're going to abandon this land, we're leaving nothing. And we have a letter by a British officer who advanced at that time, and he says, "I really hate the Germans." He said, "I don't hate them because we're fighting them. I hate them for their efficiency." And he actually says they've done an absolutely fantastic job in this withdrawal. They've literally destroyed everything, and I really hate them for being that efficient.
So, Alan Wakefield, it sounds as if you give this film 1917 a pretty good historical rating.
Yeah, definitely. And if it's a way that people can get more engaged with the First World War, it's a really good way in.
Alan Wakefield giving the film 1917 a pretty big thumbs up when it comes to authenticity. I feel quite personally about this, with a grandfather who was also fighting on the Western Front in 1917, and whose diaries show he saw things every bit as bad as portrayed in this film. Thank you for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another one along soon.